If old rooms, old griefs, and the dangerous light that lingers in glass speak to you, then subscribe now and keep me company while the lamp glows. I would rather not make this passage alone. Stay with me, and if you find the tale worth the breathing of your name in the dark, subscribe so I may know whom I address when I speak to the shadows that answer back. The house was already morning when I first stepped through its door, the air wearing crepe as plainly as the widow. It was a late year, 1899, and all the old practices had learned to hide themselves behind the fashion of modern light, yet the old work still found me. Word travels in rainwater and whispers. When an infant dies, it is either buried as quickly as possible, or it is shown to a man like me who brings out the signs of life. It is not wickedness that asks for such a portrait, it is hunger, and hunger will always find a table. I had my case, my bellows camera with the brass Petzval that had been my father's, Voigtlander glass, engraved before my hair was even thought of, my tripod polished by use, my head brace wrapped in black velvet so as not to bruise a temple, my battered plate boxes labeled with wax. The maid took me by a quieter passage so that the neighbors would not see, as if my presence would make the fact more true. The mother was in a straight-backed chair, eyes swollen like night violets, and in her lap lay the child, pale as old wax and still as prayer. There is a professional distance one might hold from grief, and another from the dead. I have learned to stand on both like a man balancing between two timbers over a winter stream. I bowed because there is no other bow in the world like that bow before a mother and her dead. They had dressed the infant beautifully, laced gown, a ridiculous smock of embroidery, a ribbon like pale rain threaded across the breast. Two small hands crossed upon the belly as if it were a tiny monastery and the child a buried saint. The father, a solicitor by his cuffs and his voice, fixed me with grey exhaustion and told me the child's name. Jonah. I repeated it. Saying a name like that warms it, and there was so much coal to go around. The light in their parlor was poor, heavy with a sky that had not yet decided to snow. I asked if there was a room that could be darkened. The father showed me to the nursery, a place hung with frosted toys and arrested motion, and I said it would do. My art needs a less boastful word than art. It is chemistry and time and patience that has learned what face patience makes on paper. I sent for my case, and while I waited I looked about that stilled room at the rocking horse that had forgotten to rock and the blocks that spelled no word. The maid returned. I took off my coat and rolled my sleeves, my wrists already tattooed a poor man's way by nitrate and pyro. Then I began. I set my tripod where the bay window began to breathe a usable light. The Petzval sang its soft metal creak as I focused on the headrest clamp. I checked my bellows for pinholes against the window's flare. I draped the black cloth and peered into the inverted little world that trembled inside the ground glass. There is a particular hush that comes over a room when one of my kind pulls the cloth over his head. The world breathes and I listen to it breathe in a different key. I twisted the rack and pinion, sharpening the mother's grieving mouth, the child's soft oval, the break in the window pane that would later become a tremor in the print, if I allowed it to remain, which sometimes I do because truth is as instructive as beauty. The head brace was for the mother. Even living subjects learn to envy stones when I ask them to hold their faces. For the child, I laid a rolled towel, covered it in the same black velvet to cradle the skull, and told the mother we would be done quickly. I told her she must not weep during the exposure, must not rock. She nodded as if accepting a bitter oath. I have seen such nods in other houses. The father looked away. He had done his crying before the daylight. In my little traveling darkroom, my tent no bigger than a wardrobe and lamplit with a ruby glass lantern, I opened a wooden box and took out a glass plate already coated with gelatin and silver bromide, as good a dry plate as chemistry had figured. Wet plate had been my apprenticeship. The wetted breath of collodion, the dance of the silver nitrate bath, how it will bite your skin black as a sin that no priest quite recognizes, how it wants an unbroken run from pouring to sensitizing to exposure to development, like a prayer that cannot afford to stutter. But dry plates had freed me into another habit of dread. The dread of patience, the dread of seeing more than I wished, because they saw well in low light and in the still rooms where the dead lay like tricks of the drapery. Still, in the back of my case was a little bottle of lunar caustic, the old silver nitrate, and a dish I kept beside the developer tray. Sometimes an intensifier is needed, sometimes a reducer, depending upon what one thinks one wishes to bring up out of shadows. The plate, now, I slid into its black holder, shut the slide, and returned to the parlor where the nursery had become a chapel. I thought in seconds, tried to imagine the way the dim winter would climb onto the plate. I set the aperture wide. This Petzval would demand nothing else, its portraits all a kind of soft fall-off from a precise and merciless center, and I told the mother that when I lifted my hand, she would fix her gaze upon the child's hairline and think of nothing else. A man of God might ask the same. I whispered, not certain to whom, "Be ready." I drew the dark slide with a small rasp that always wakes me. I watched the air. It trembled as if I had plucked it. During exposures, I do not breathe more than I must, though my breath does not fog the plate. Superstition is the child of repetition. And in that exhalation hunger, I saw something that had no name, the faintest flicker, as if the ruby light inside my tent had been stirred, except it wasn't, of course. It was the window and the mother and the white oval of the child gathering the world into themselves. A vibration, nothing more, perhaps the coach in the street jarring a nerve between my eyes. Long seconds pass differently when the room is asked to become a small moon. Then I closed the shutter. The mother let out a thread of breath that had been strangling her. I told her we were very close, that I would make another. It is always better to make more. It gives the living a task, which is a kindness. I made 3, varying the stop a breath each time, varying in small ways the moment where I believed the day might consent to enter the glass. Then to my tent. I do not hurry to see what I have done. It is part ritual, part cowardice. The smell of my trade, the sharp vinegar of the stop, the brown sour of pyro developer, the salt clean of hypo, the metallic whisper that lives in glass even before it is asked to bear an image. I set the ruby glass to a higher wick. In its light, I slid the first plate from its holder, dipped and rocked it, and made myself look. If you have never watched a face arrive out of darkness, you have never understood that arrival can be as terrible as departure. One by one, the tones assemble, the shadows decide where to dwell, the whites confess themselves, and the eyes, if they are there, turn the whole act into a proof. The mother's mouth had done its duty, the line of her chin had not trembled. The child's oval was soft and faithful. The small brows, the innocent nose. And then the eyes. A photographer learns to speak of eyes as a topographer speaks of gullies and light and the places where snow lingers longest. Dead eyes do not catch light, they certainly do not give it back. Most often the lids remain shut, which is helpful. If opened they are pools with no surface. We who make memento mori know the little means. A hint of pencil on the lid to suggest a lash's shadow, a delicate tint to suggest the iris in paint, or if one is working upon the negative itself, one jots with an etching knife in the blacks to allow a white to glint where no white had glinted. This is nothing more nor less than mercy. I have told myself that often enough to wear the word smooth. On this plate, I watched as the eyes declared their absence as expected. The lids were not fully shut. The mother must have stroked them, meaning to keep them solemn but open to their last, so the pupils were dull coins. And then, as if a careless hand in the sun had moved a mirror, the smallest curl of light nested itself there, a tiny hook in each where there should be none. I thought it a bubble in the emulsion, a happy flaw. It was placed very like a catchlight would be if I had placed a lamp at 45 degrees and a truer world had existed where such lamps are always to be had. I peered, I swayed the plate to and fro, and the light seemed to move with me. That can be said of any shine, I know. But I felt it keep me as the plate kept it. I said aloud into the tent, not to any person but to the mechanics of my work, no strange lights in the room. No curtains moving. And then, perhaps the crack in the pane had taken a shine and handed it to me. Such a thing happens, one takes what is given. I set the plate to wash and slid the next into the tray. The second plate's eyes lacked the hook. The third had it and only one. Irritation then. Ghosting is the word that frightened clients use. Halation, double imaging, a nick or dirt in the holder, a light leak. These are mine. But halation does not choose one eye then both. Dirt does not mimic intention. We must have down the mother again. We must have another hour of her sitting so the light can choose its breath. So I thought, with the small curse of the industrious, it will take 2 hours to finish what I had hoped to do in one, and the widow will fold a little more into herself as she sits those extra minutes. And still I felt warmed by the thought that I might make something good. Not the deceit of life, I do not subscribe to the more theatrical claims of our trade, but the suggestion that life had recently passed here, that if the room were very quiet we might hear its footsteps going down the stairs. That is not a lie. I asked the family for another sitting after the first plates had been set to fix, their milky remnants of silver halide turning to transparency under a bath that in older books is called hyposulfite and in my mouth is simply hypo. The father agreed. The mother did not truly hear me and nodded. I adjusted the head brace once more, took all care with the child's posture, for sometimes, as unkind as a fact can be, rigor has not yet instructed the limbs to behave, and one must support what kindness the body has refused to offer. I closed the curtains further to control the window's contribution. I lowered my stand to match the infant's face more perfectly. Again the cloth over my head, again the little world inverted, the crescent of mother and child afloat like a visitation in a glass. I do not know when I began to feel that what I was watching me. The ground glass showed the infant's eyes dull and open, no glint at all. They are upside down in that ground glass, two small moons hanging beneath a pale shore. I leaned closer to check the sharpness. I thought of stopping down another notch to lengthen the seconds, to gather more of the eyelid's texture. And then the pupils, still as nothing, seemed to alter, not their position, but the quality of their darkness, as if what had been velvet became water. It is the sort of report a man would not make publicly for fear of losing his fee. I blinked. I breathed. The child did not breathe. I took the slide and made the exposure. 5 seconds, maybe 6, while a carriage passed below and the ceiling whispered a complaint at the cold. I closed the shutter and drew the slide and said that we would make one last for safety. After the last had been made and I had thanked them, and the mother had kissed the child's brow, and it was the second time that morning that I bowed to them both, I returned to my tent for development. I do not indulge in flourishes once the plate is in the tray. Delay is already a flourish. The developer woke the shapes at once. The mother, again miraculous in her stillness. The child. The curve of an ear. The fine cuff. And the eyes, the same hook appeared, those twin-minute crescents, but they were not where they had been before. The catchlights were placed as if the lamp in the room had moved. But there had been no lamp and the window had been still. The hook of light belonged, if it belonged at all, in the upper right of each pupil on the first plate, suggesting a source above and to the sitter's left. On this one, it was high and to the opposite side. My mind placed my own reflection in the glass. Only the ground glass lets me see myself, and even then only as a smudge when the cloth is generous. I thought, you leaned differently, you leaned toward the child, your shoulders moved, the window lent you a glimmer. All reasonable. All insufficient. On the third plate, something else appeared. Do not imagine a miracle. It was an abrasion of the ordinary made to gleam by distress. A slight doubling on the infant's lashes, a misalignment scarcely the width of a breath, that said the plate holder had shivered, or the stand had settled, or I had allowed my hand to touch the tripod wood. Yet the doubling did not touch the mother's face, only the infant's lashes insisted on 2 positions. I stared until the wet slowness of hypo made me impatient. The negatives went to wash and I took my long breath between work and more work. The house was quiet outside my canvas. I could hear the maid's shoes weeping their dread down and up the stair and the father making patterns in the grate with the poker as if law might be found there. There is an unkind hour in the middle of the day when a man must prepare proofs to show a family, and his heart must be his hands. I lit the large room the father had kindly allowed me for a dark room. Heavy curtains pinned, the ruby safe light hung high so that it would neither tempt nor offend when I worked near the ground trays. I scissored strips of albumen paper to size, though most of my colleagues now swore by the new baryta-coated gelatins. In my case, habit and stock determined the choice. I laid the glass upon the paper to print by contact, set them in a press under weight, then drew them one by one to the window to give them their portion of the day. Ortho paper loves the blue and I loved that day's thin and faithful cold. I timed by knowing the way veins in my hand look when the light has done its work. A superstition again? Perhaps. I learned long ago the sun keeps better time than the clock inside my head. As the prints took their ghost upon themselves, I set the negatives in a rack and leaned them toward the lamplight to dry. I took out my retouching kit, varnish, pencils soft as fur, a stump for blending, the etching knife, the reducer bath, a little of farmer's ferrocyanide mixed with hypo to pull back the heavy blacks, with which one can carve light into dullness, and dullness into light, also if need be, the old bottle of silver nitrate to lay into the eyes if an intensification begged for it, as a priest might lay a thumb of ash upon a forehead. You learn to finesse all this. The face's contour is a bell struck faintly, I find my way to where the sound wants to go. If I saw a pore too wide, I softened it. If the mother's mouth trembled too much as print, I would ask the line to sit more decorously. The child's lids, though, are the territory where mercy becomes a negotiation. I have drawn faint lashes where none had consented to appear. I have scratched in a pinhead of white at the iris, a catchlight placed where the lie would be kindest. It is not resurrection. It is a candle in a cold room. When the prints were fixed and washed and set to dry against the glass, I went to the father and mother and came back with them to the little room where I had pinned black cloth over a mantel to serve as a makeshift gallery. I showed them the first prints, and the mother did not close her fingers. She held them like a psalter, breathing with her mouth, taken by the image of herself where her pain had been folded seriously and would be now a way to remember her seriousness. The child she could not bear to look at long. She would glance and then lift her face to some corner of the room and then look again and then away. The father was grateful for what he could comprehend: composition, respect, a faithfulness that did not stab. He looked at me once, after an interval, as if I had offered him a draught that was not water but would satisfy something he knew was thirst. I said that if they wished, I could attend to the eyes, make the smallest lights, so that the face would seem less asleep. His gaze flicked to the mother. She could not speak, she nodded, a mere tilt. The father whispered, "Life." Not a plea. A category. I returned to my bench with the negatives. The first of the fresh plates lay ready for my work. I breathed on it. Mine is a winter set of lungs. They showed me in the cloud of warmth, where the varnish had dried perfectly. With the etching knife, I touched the blank of the left pupil, making a tiny crescent that would print as a white bead. I made another on the right. I stepped back and looked sideways. Sometimes a glance crookedly renders justice more than a direct stare. Yes, it would be enough. I thought briefly to bleach a touch of shadow from the lower lid, so that the child would seem less as if he had been crying in his last sleep. I took out a fine brush, dipped it in the reducer and lifted the blackness in a single breath of a stroke, then washed it away before it could chew too much. The face was now not quite alive because that is not how life is. Rather, it was attentive to the idea that life could be. Which is what all my clients are, after all. When I printed those, I did not call the family at once. I made a second set so that we might compare. It is important in grief to offer choices that do not do harm. The sun had gone milk-white by then, and the prints took a little longer to reach their rightful densities. I hummed a tune my mother had hummed when she kept the collodion at blood warmth in winter. A nonsense melody, the noise women make when they are wrapping a thing to save it until morning. When the papers had dried enough and been flattened in the press, I carried them, with fingers that had developer brown sunk in the nail beds, to the parlor. They looked. People always look at the eyes last. The mother did not. She went there first and then stayed longer than any life can afford to stay anywhere. She said something that I pretend I did not hear. It would be wrong to repeat it. The father thanked me. He tried all the proper sentences on his tongue and none of them came out shamingly. I bowed my head again because there are times when I am less a man than a mechanism for bowing. I told them I would deliver the album later that week and left them to their privacy while I packed my case. It is always then that a house shows you itself. The nursery took me in again like a church at dusk. The rocking horse was still. The air had become a heavier thing. I broke down my tripod, unclamped the lens. I reached for the head brace and found that the velvet had taken a dent where the mother's sorrow had rested. I smoothed it with my thumb. I lifted the brace to stow it, and as I did so, there in the looking-glass above the mantel I saw the peculiarest ordinary thing. Myself with the long hinge of the brace like a question mark behind me, and the empty chair where the child had lain. My face looked older than my face, which is the sort of picture mirrors prefer. In the corner of that glass too, this is important, I saw the bassinet. Its coverlet was turned back a finger's width as if the air had tugged it. The maid had likely fussed before me and left it so. I tell you this because all along I wished to tell you that I am not a man seeking to be haunted. Certain rooms will haunt any man who sees them with the light off. I did not blame the mirror for doing what mirrors do, catch stray motions and hold them out like coins. I left the house. The street declared itself with the bluntness of horses and cold. I made my way back to my shop. It is 2 floors, the lower with its waiting table and iron stove, my ledger, the shelf of albums, the narrow glass case of frames and carte de visite remnants that no one truly buys anymore, the upper with my proper darkroom, the big sinks against the north wall, the silvered tacks where I pin paper to dry, the long oak bench stained like the hand of a man too long at the soil, the ruby lamps, the ceiling watermark that looks like an island lost to fog. I set the day's negatives to wash, then laid them in the drying cabinet with the charcoal brazier beneath to keep the air moving. I locked the door. I made my supper of bread and meat with a pickle. I poured a little of the whiskey that a miner once gave me in exchange for a portrait of his mother with her hands clasped in her lap. She was living then but not for long, and the picture was hung above the mantel of a tavern for years. I drank. I listened to my building remember itself around me. At night I often have the decency to sleep very badly. Our business discards a portion of the day's light when we fix an image. The discarded light lies awake in the walls until someone thinks a thought unwise. Mine are unwise most after midnight. I dream of plates I never made, and rooms that have not yet been unlatched for me and yet know my name. That night I dreamed of an eye. I must be honest, it is a dreary habit when men tell you their dreams. Mine will not improve by being told. Still, an eye seemed terribly close, so close I could not tell if it looked like an infant's or a woman's, so close that I could see the crackle of the emulsion upon it like winter in a ditch. In the dream, my hand descended, the etched knife in it, to make a catchlight upon that eye, to tell the viewers there was glass between the world and the world. As the knife tip touched the black of that pupil, a brightness bled outward, not white, not silver, but a shine that made a room in its own way. The pupil accepted the light as if it were not light but listening. I woke with my hand clenched and the dull soreness of having kept my fingers folded against my palm too long. When I went upstairs that morning, the upper darkroom smelled like this: damp glass, cold ruby, the memory of acetic acid, and the afterghost of pyro. My hands, when I washed them in the basin, shed more brown than most men's hands. Shit. I set the kettle to boil so that the paste would mix more kinder. Then I opened the drying cabinet. What I saw there undid my court manners. I swore, and not prettily. One of the infant's plates had buckled off its frame and tips, fallen against the wire mesh, and taken a small scratch where it had kissed the metal. This happens. It is why we made more than one. My heart made its practiced a rhythm when I picked it up and examined the damage. The scratch ran in a diagonal across the child's right eye, a line that, if printed, would seem a strange lightning lodged there. I touched the edges. It was not deep. The emulsion had scuffed but not lifted. I took the retouching varnish to smooth it and set it aside to rest. I told myself such ordinary lies. This will do, the family will never know, you will choose a better negative to print from, you have others. But then I saw the other plate. The first of the exposures, my first of the second set, stood upright just where I had left it. Light from the window made a little theater in it. The infant's face was serene. The printed catchlights I had cut into the pupils the day before knew their place. Everything else was as it should be, except that the catchlights were a fraction higher than I had cut them. This is the place in the telling where I am turned into a liar by necessity. Plates do not alter with the night. The etched mark is an arithmetic of the hand. It does not shift. The fraction of change could be explained by the angle of my head when I compared, by the distortion of memory, by the angle of the plate to the light. I told myself these. I told myself them as I brought the plate under the bench lamp and tilted it, and as I set it upright again, and as I brought up another to compare. They still sat wrong by the smallest measurable disobedience. More disturbing, beneath that hospital order brightness, the pupil of the left eye held a softness as if underneath my etching, beneath the baked-in retouching varnish, beneath the emulsion itself, a second reflection waited. A second catchlight, ghosted in gray. I laid the plate flat, put the weakest magnifier to it, and saw that my etching mark lay clean and crisp, but the ghost beneath was of another geometry altogether, a little ovoid like the reflection of a man. The sort of thing that would have been the shape of my head and shoulders if I had been a light in the child's eye. I set down the magnifier. My hand shook. Not because I believed the child had seen me. Because the little physics of the thing would not behave and I could not answer it with a knife or a formula. This is the sequence of my errors then. I worked longer that day than I should have. I printed more of the plates and handled more than my portion of nitrate, of hypo, of acids, so that the darkroom grew a perfume of agency, a thing in itself, not just a smell. I prepared a reducer stronger than was advisable, and I used it too near my hands. The pyro brown of my fingers grew into a more serious brown and the nails darkened where they had been black already. I lived with these marks. I liked them, I confess. They made me a priest of my trade. But the rest is not vanity. I opened the bottle of silver nitrate because I had an idea. If an extra catchlight had arrayed itself under my knife edge in the left pupil, this ghost reflection, then I would play a trick on the trick. A thought came to me I had seen in a French journal once, wherein a man had bleached a portion of emulsion very lightly, stopped it, and then painted the thinnest wash of nitrate to it and redeveloped the plate. The treated portion rose like bread in an oven, and he made from it a gleam where no gleam had been. He used it on jewels, on buttons, on eyes. I had never had cause to try it except in one reckless moment years ago when a mother had insisted her daughter had been alive, not dying, when the plate was made, and I, a weak man pushed by the shrillness of her desire, had given the face a clever spark it had not earned. I do not pride myself on that memory. I set the plate on the bench. I carefully applied a small dot of reducer to the center of each pupil on another of the negatives in the set, stopped it, washed it, dried its surface on my heated plate. Then I wetted a fine brush, the hair torn to a single tail, and sucked up a bead of silver nitrate, pressed it to a cloth to nearly erase it, then touched the brush to the place where I had made the pallor. It dried in a heartbeat. I washed the plate, set it to breathe, poured developer over, gentle as if bathing the forehead of a fevering child, and watched. The dots rose, not as white, for this is not painting on glass. They rose in density and then condensed, a condensation of light. Once the plate was fixed and washed and dried, I carried it to the light and looked at my handiwork. The eyes now held not only the etched catchlight, but a denser core that did not read as a scratch but as a bead of true reflection. I had sealed into the emulsion a false truth that the light now honored as if it had come to the plate honestly. I smiled. I hate that I admit it. There is pleasure in making light behave. For all that I felt pleased, a shadow tugged. For when I took up another negative from the rack, the first exposure of the day untouched by new trickery, I saw, in the corner of the child's right eye, a pit so small that no one would have noticed it in a print except me, the sort of pinhole one gets when a bit of dust has adhered during sensitization in the factory, and I knew that pit had not been there yesterday. A flaw does not wait a day to present itself. Unless, there are too many unless in my life. I went to the magnifier again, trained it over the tiny pit. It had a rim. It looked like the depression a drop of breath might make on a cold window. This is not a metaphor, is it? We breathe on plates to feel their life under our hands. We breathe on glass to see where varnish smears and where it holds. I breathed on the plate. My breath fogged the emulsion, showed me the stroke of the varnish beneath, and as my fog receded, the little pit glistened like the place where a fingertip on a winter window has asked to be let in. I went to the window. My head hurt. I stood there and fisted my eyes against the sill. The sun in winter is a nurse who has determined to withhold until the patient begs. I was suddenly so tired of bargaining with light. When one has bargained with it as long as I have, one suspects that what answers is not the light at all, but something practicing to be it. I went downstairs to my shop and opened the door and watched the world tread past and promised myself I would not bring any more dead children into my rooms for a month, though I knew perfectly well this promise is like any other I have made. That afternoon, the father arrived at my door with an awkwardness that told me the errand went against his grain. He said he wished for one more plate because his sister had said the child had a dimple that had not been shown, and that it comforted her to imagine it and she would be comforted more to see it. I could have told him that any comfort the mind works hard it cannot bear the weight of proof, but instead I said, "Yes, sir. If you would allow me to come at dusk, I can use the darkness to guide the room. Sometimes a shadow is a better teacher than a brightness." He nodded. We selected an hour. He left with a clumsy blessing tucked into the apology. It is ungentlemanly to confess that one goes to a child's corpse twice in a day. But I did. Back up those steps, back into that silence that felt as if it had been hammered flat. The mother had not moved from the chair much in the hours between. Her hair had fretted loose. The child lay as before, except that the air had learned his shape better and would not disturb him at all. Dusk carries its own mercy. What the window had denied in the morning, it allowed now in a gentler proportion. I did not want to ask the mother again to submit to the head brace, so I contrived a steadiness from the chair arms and my tripod slipped forward a fraction to compensate, and the Petzval lens gathered the little light like a miser. That creak of the bellows is the song that accompanies my life, its sigh is my own. Under the dark cloth, I found them again upside down, again connected by the little bridge of arms and lace. And again, I must be careful to say it exactly, the eyes of the child, dull as pennies as before, seemed to name me in their emptiness. The pupils were no longer water or velvet or any of the silly words we use to make ourselves feel that we have categories. They were two places in a glass where an event had already happened. I focused. I set the stop. There was a sound then, not in the room but in the lens, a frail whisper as if something had slid across the front glass, not outside but in the space only light knows. I thought my own sleeve had brushed the mount, and I stopped my heart's foolishness. I exposed. I liked the length of it, how the seconds pulled into a clean rope. I did a second, and a third that was very long indeed, long enough that the mother's mouth at last had to tremble, and trembled, and I did not have the heart to scold it. In the tent, I developed with a piety that would have made a curate jealous. The plates bloomed. On the long exposure, there was the classic narrative. The mother sharp enough to be believed but with the mouth softening into a smear where the last seconds had worn her faith, the child spare and precise and forgiving. And in the pupils, very little appeared. The plate had taken a dullness there that pleased me. It was chaste. No tricks. On the second, though, the catchlights had returned and I had not scratched them. Two again placed as if a lamp had moved at my shoulder. And in one, no larger than a pearl button, the black core held a figure like a reflection of a man leaning close. There is a certain demarcation between professional annoyance and alarm. I had crossed it. I packed the negatives and told the family I would return their album within 2 days. The mother said, "Please make him bright." You understand, of course, that what she meant had nothing to do with the chemistry of plates. Back in my rooms, I handled the plates as if time would break them. I set each in a dish of water. I approached each with a lamp and a slow eye. The violin of my work sounds worse to me when I play at night. The ruby safe light makes my hands seem dipped in wine. I took up my retouching kit and thought to be simple. No shocks, only the most delicate suggestion. I wondered if my new little invention with nitrate and reducer would do its work faithfully at last. Before I began, I did the decent thing and made a cup of tea as hot as there was sense to make it. I took down my old notes from my apprentice days, ridiculous scraps and a skew of hands, where I had written in one breath silver nitrate bath, collodion, glove, gallic acid, pyro not too warm, always keep hypo fresh, no dust, no dust, no dust. I smiled at the boy who had made those copies, who had stained his sleeves with ether and taken a spoon to stir a silver bath as if it were soup. How healthy he had been before he learned what the dead teach. I breathed on the plate. I laid the smallest kidney of reduction on the pupil's dan. I pulled it back at once with a wash of water. I dried it with a careful blow of breath. I tipped a nearly dry brush of nitrate into that little pallor. When it had dried, I flooded the image with developer. The plate answered me at once as if it had been waiting to be asked. The pupils became living black. The catchlights rose like moons behind glass. I almost laughed and then my joy twisted into something else. The catchlights slid. I do not know another word. I do not mean they appeared to be in different places when I tilted the plate. I mean that they moved. 2-minute silver beads slid within the dark to find a new position, the position they had held when the mother lifted the child in her mind and looked at him as if he had not died. I set the plate down very carefully. I told myself that developer sometimes has currents, that a wash can leave a curl of motion in the emulsion that settles meanly. I told myself ghost stories made of physics. I told myself any necessary lie. Then I took up the plate I had not touched with this trick at all and watched its pupils until my eyes wept from the strain, and nothing moved. When one thing moves in a world of stillness, you can call it madness. When more than one does, you begin to call it by its match. After this, the days arranged themselves to be suspicious. When I printed from the plate whose pupils had slid, small variations began to creep into every image I made of that child. In one print, the catchlight on the left eye was high, the right low. In the next, both high. In one, a faint edge of a reflection, my own, I say plain, had stowed away like a thief in the pupil, a gray oval no larger than a thought. In the next, the gray was gone, leaving only the brightness. All this could be pressed into the book of natural errors. Poor pressure during printing, the paper lifted a fraction, the negative flexed in drying. But then there came the misalignment. I placed 2 of the new prints side by side on the drying board and saw, without any wish to see, that the child's mouth was not where it had been. I'm not a fool. The negative is the negative. The print must answer what is asked of it. There can be no movement of the mouth on the paper if the glass above has not altered. But the small bow of the upper lip had altered its curve by the thickness of a penknife. And in 3 prints from that day, the arch of the left brow rose as if surprised, while in others it did not. You would call me blind if you saw them quickly. I would call myself sick. I did not sleep. I sent no album to that family, to my shame. I sent a note that the glue had refused to hold, a foolish phrase, and asked for a day more. I began to go up and down the stairs like a man being taught to pace. When I made tea, the kettle whistled like a schoolchild complaining of the slate. When I entered the darkroom, the ruby lamp took a breath as if it had been waiting to do so in silence for me. The sink's slow drip kept a bad rhythm. The plates leaned against each other as if cell to cell like bodies in a plague. I washed my hands to rid them of stain, and the brownness spread under the water like a rumor. The head brace leaned in its corner on the high shelf like a monk leaning against a graveyard stone to gossip with briars. And that night, at an hour not midnight but despair o'clock, I set out the plates in a row and told myself to be coward no more. I would choose one only, and cut a retouch that would forbid the eye to wander. I would turn the pupils away from mischief and fix them upon a single remembered world, the world the mother wanted. I took up the knife. I breathed. I will not be ashamed to say I prayed. In my old faith, perhaps, it would have been called sacrilege to use the word in my trade, but we make ambassadors of light here, we coax and we fix and we wash away the light that does not serve, and if that is not a sacrament, it is a crime I have loved too long. As I leaned, my breath fogged the plate and then cleared. And as it cleared, just for the length of one heartbeat, there was a little fog within the plate, on the other side of the emulsion, as if breath had been trapped there and could not find its way out to my side. The old silver nitrate bath sat stoppered near my hand, its meniscus like a black eye. I thought of my father's hands, burned to a permanent glove by winters of collodion and lunar caustic. He had kept his silver as religiously as any man keeps wine. He believed it felt insults. The moment steeped. The breath within the glass dwindled. I put down the knife. There is a story photographers exchange when they are too drunk to be clean, that the old memento men used to paint pupils on closed lids, and that once a child opened its eyes and looked directly at the man holding the brush and then closed them forever. The story is a forgery, or else it has happened to us all in ways no witness can certify. I did not paint. I printed. I made 6 prints, one after another, to gauge what new disobedience the plate would permit. In the 5th, the infant's eyes had the catchlights placed neatly as I had carved and coaxed them. In the 6th, the catchlights had climbed yet again, and were now high enough that I could not say they were anything but their own will. The catchlights in that 6th were wrong in a way that woke me from whatever half-life I had been living until then. They were not rounded. They had the shape of the window behind me. The window with its crack like a thin vein through one pane. The window that had been behind me when I, leaning, had looked into the child's mirrored emptiness. The catchlights were of that window precisely, but inverted, the world printed back upon the world. This is the place where a man puts his head into his hands and begins to bargain. I had believed myself the maker of the little shining eyes, the retoucher, the demander, the dealer in slivers of light. Yet which portions had I made? Which portions had merely used my knife to introduce themselves? If a window could find its way into a pupil that had not been alive to accept it, what else could find its way? Your own face, whispered someone who was not anyone. My father's ledger keeps a list in a burnt orange hand, the names and the small sums and the little services, a lock of hair, a curl arranged against the cheek, a locket laid upon a breast, a hand closed as if it had never learned to open. Additions, I have done them all. Subtractions, I have turned away a scar. I have diminished a lividness. I have removed a stain that would have embarrassed a family more than it would have taught them anything about love. Complicity, the word grows long bones. I took down his ledger and found my own hand sitting on top of his. Many years later, the same habits, the same pity, the same fees, the same sloping cruelties of the dates. I did not make albums for that family the next day, nor the next. I made a dozen more prints that I do not know why I made. I tried to force the plate to give the same catchlight twice. It would not. I tried to bleach out the pupils entirely, then paint them back. They returned before the paint dried. I tried to scratch away the extra reflections. They hid beneath the layer my knife could reach. I tried to intensify nothing, then everything. The more I insisted, the more the pupils offered me versions of a world I did not want to own, the more they gave me faces of men leaning in, the more they handed me a window with a crack that looked like a vein. On the 3rd day, exhausted, I carried the album under my cloak to the house. The father answered and his eyes thanked me before his mouth did. He bade me come into his study. The mother was not with him. He closed the door and then did something that burned me more than my chemicals ever had. He reached for me blindly and touched my sleeve as if it were a rung on a ladder. She says, he started and stopped. He held the album like it was hot. She says your plates have made the baby look at her. She says that if he can look he can see. She is lost in it. Will you, sir, will you make me a version that is less alive? The word alive is not something a man says plainly in such a context, yet he did. I felt then the inventory of my sins. I told him yes. I told him I would bring a set made from the first simple plates, the ones from the morning with no embellishments, only the truth we could stand. He thanked me and then, before he could think better of it, he pressed the album back into my hands and said quietly, please burn this. When I opened it later, I saw that the prints I had sent were the ones whose catchlights had danced and whose reflections had betrayed me. I do not know when I placed them with such cruelty. I only know that I did, and that his words were a scythe. Back in my rooms, I built a fire in the iron stove and stood with the album at my knee and could not do it. One does not burn the dead. One keeps them. One shelves them. One stacks them with foxed letters and a hatbox of old hair. One does not burn except by mistake. I laid the album on the table instead and opened it to the worst of the prints, the one where the window had printed itself most baldly in the pupil. I brought my magnifier down into that little geography. In the right eye, high at the margin of the catchlight, if I believed my tools, there was the ghost of a face that could have been mine, because whose else would a boy see? But there was a notch at the ear that I do not have. There was a line down the cheek that looked like a scar I do not bear. I pressed my lips together hard so I would not say anything I could not unsay. In the left eye, smaller, so tiny the world would call me a liar even in print, was another face, thin as a hair, a woman's or the skin of one. I stood up abruptly, knocked the chair backward, cursed. I told myself, this is the pattern of the varnish. This is occlusion and emulsion. This is your own guilt painting pictures. This is why men drink. This is why champions of scientific thought say our trade is trickery. Then, fueled by clarity as clean and vicious as fresh hypo, I took the album, shoved it into the stove and watched it catch. The paper sighed. The heat made the photographs warp as if they were alive to their own deaths. The eyes closed last. You will think that this ended it. That the prints ceased to twitch. That the plates held still. That the father and mother were relieved by the new album I brought, the simpler one, the one with eyes that looked like decent sleep. That I returned to other commissions and told no one and set my mind into a box. That is how endings are made for those who delight in neat moral shelves. But they did not make their home in me. For this is not a story about an album. It is about a bargain that had been struck long before I knew the terms. Years ago, let me pull the drawer of my mind, the one with the thin human hair tied in blue thread. Years ago, in the country where the roads are honest and the poor carry more than their portion of other people's dead, a woman brought me her husband in a chair. He had died with his eyes open and mean, and she asked me to soften him, to make him look less as if he had nothing left to lose. I shut his lids and the lids would not stay shut. I set coins and he merely looked more like himself than before. I did a thing then that I told myself was necessity. I painted the faintest iris upon his lids with a pale watercolor and photographed him with a lamp to the side so that the painted pupils would receive a little sheen and read as if his eyes were almost closed in gentle thought, not death. When I developed, the light had taken my paint very kindly and turned it to a truth no one questioned. The family left with a portrait where the old man lived a little more kindly than he had sat in life. That night, someone came to my door and stood on the landing and did not knock. I opened to nothing. On the floor was an old medicine bottle, stoppered, with a little silver coin inside. No one admitted to leaving it. When I poured a drop from that bottle on the next day's negative in experiment, it leapt to silver like a wolf to meat. I kept that bottle. I kept it with my collodion and my gallic acid. I have, in short, been paying a tithe to a god that never signed his name. This is the bargain I did not understand, then, that each time I made the illusion of life so sweet that a man or woman sharpened their hunger upon it, I laid down a coin of myself. It is not that the dead feed. It is that the little life in the room, mine or the mother's or the father's, learned to reside in the plate as comfortably as it did in us. The emulsion is made to arrest light. It does not care whether the light is only light or something posing as it. After the burning of the album, I slept a foul sleep. In the morning I went upstairs and the ruby lamp was already burning as if it had decided to be the dawn. The plates were in their rack. The one with the sliding catchlights had gained, in the night, a hair. A portion of hair, stuck just at the emulsion's edge. It was blonde, the infant had been dark-haired. I lifted it with a wetted brush. It clung as if it had longed to be there. When I set it on a white slip of paper, it made a sentence in a language I do not understand. I threw it away. Then, out of both cowardice and duty, I made prints from the first, simple plates to carry to the father, the set he had asked for, the less alive. They came out with the ordinary decencies of my trade, and I wrapped them in tissue and cut the paper with a knife that did not shake. On my way to deliver, I passed the undertaker. He was setting out fresh black cloth. He nodded an acquaintance's nod. "Do they look like themselves?" he asked. "None of us intends to be a sadist. We simply have a profession of naming what is not." "Yes," I answered, because there is nothing else to say. He lifted the black cloth and pinned it, and for a second the pin flashed white in the seam of the fabric like an eye. I went on. The father received the new album as if it were a loaf of bread, and I left him the comfort of the hallway to consume it in. I did not want to cross the threshold of the family room, as if crossing would allow something that had been permissible to become formal. He pressed money into my hand, and more than what our agreement had required, and I could not refuse it without making of it a sacrilege to his grief. When I turned toward the door, he said almost calmly, "She says you brought him into the room last night." I stopped. The only truth then was to allow the lie to be told. I said, "I was not here." He said, "I know." She says the baby looked at her. He turned. His face wore disgust at the absurdity, the self-disgust of a man choking down what love proposes. I told him the truth of craft. Sometimes eyes in prints will seem to follow if the catchlights stand. It is a familiar illusion. He stared at me as if I had pressed a blade between his ribs where it would do a little good. I said my leave and left. I returned to my rooms. I closed my door and locked it to keep the ordinary world out. When I climbed the stairs, there was the faintest shine in the dark room that did not come from my lamps. I do not own words for it. It was the sheen a saint's bone would give off in a church if saints were scientific. It was the glitter of frost on a sill remembered by a child. It was the bright of a teardrop on a thumb in a dream. It was the shine of the tiny catchlights in an infant's eyes that a man with a dull knife and a better ambition had coaxed from the world. And there, on my bench, lay the plate that had not been there when I left, because I keep my plates like accounts and I know their order. It was the plate from 3 days ago, the second exposure. It lay face up, dry as a law, and on it, in each pupil, the catchlights were so high they would have belonged to a ceiling sun. The edges of those catchlights held shapes that I knew too well, the window with its vane and a curve of a shoulder. I remember sitting down. I remember the tile pattern on the floor biting my eyes because I could not look at anything else, then the courage, the stupidity, that makes men stay. I lifted the plate. I went to the sink. I turned the tap and let water run as if water might drown a thing that is not alive. I held the plate under and saw the water lay down itself on the emulsion like a film. Under the water, the catchlight slid again. I laughed because there are only 3 sounds in a room when a man has lost the argument with his tools: laughter, the sound of metal on wood, and prayer. I set the plate aside. I wiped my face on my sleeve. I thought of the folk who come to my counter to ask whether I can bring their dead to them with a little brightness, the wives and the fathers and the little ones. I thought of all the times I have said yes. When a bargain hunts a man, it isn't the clause he read by lamplight that catches him. It is the blank space beneath. I looked for the bottle that had been left for me years ago. It was on the top shelf where I keep dangerous things, in case of children, though I have none. I uncorked it and the smell, clean as a cut, rose. I held the bottle to the light. The little coin the stranger had left with it glittered at the bottom through the blackness, like an eye inverted. I poured it into a dish and with my brush wet its surface and wrote on the back of one of the plates my own name in